The car slowed down in front of the familiar gate. Mom was already standing inside the yard, one hand holding the gate open and the other motioning for me to drive in. I rolled down the window to say hello and pulled into the open space beside the porch. Dad was sitting in a chair near the door. He watched me get out of the car and asked a few questions about work and the kids, then turned to Mom and reminded her to get the fruit she had already set aside in the kitchen. I laughed and told her I had just arrived, so there was no need to start preparing things for me to take home already, but Mom went inside anyway. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A work message appeared on the screen, with a notification from the trading app underneath it. After replying to the message, I opened my portfolio and saw that the stock had gone up again. The current price was higher than the last time I had checked. The profit on the shares I was still holding continued to grow, while the target I had calculated was still a little high. I opened the note I had photographed from my notebook and placed the two numbers side by side. The distance between them wasn't as wide as before. If it kept going like this, maybe it wouldn't take much longer. Mom called from inside the house, so I turned off the screen. She had placed a plate of fruit on the table as she sat down. She asked whether I was bringing the kids over that weekend. I answered, then turned to listen as Dad told me about someone he knew who had recently stopped by. Dad got up and walked into the backyard to check on some potted plants, and I followed him. A few branches had grown beyond their frames. He pointed them out and said he would probably have to trim them that week. I bent down to look at a pot sitting close to the wall, then helped him move it somewhere with more sunlight. Mom called us inside for lunch. The meal was no different from the other times I had visited, but the conversation moved from the kids, to people in the neighborhood, to a few things my parents were thinking about fixing around the house. My phone had been left on the table outside. From the moment I sat down, I didn't pick it up again. After lunch, I helped Mom carry some bowls into the kitchen, then went back outside to sit with Dad. The sunlight in the yard had shifted, and the shadow from the porch stretched farther across the tiles. Dad was still telling the story he hadn't finished earlier. Every now and then, Mom would call out from inside to correct one of the details, making all three of us laugh. It wasn't until I stood up to leave that Mom remembered the bag of fruit she had prepared. She brought it out, opened it one more time to check what was inside, then tied the bag tightly before handing it to me. I told her we still had fruit at home. She put it straight into my hand anyway and told me to take it back for the kids. I placed the bag in the car, turned around to say goodbye to my parents, then closed the door. Through the rearview mirror, I could still see them standing inside the gate as I drove to the end of the street. By the time I got home, the sun was already low. The kids ran out to see what their grandparents had sent them, and the bag of fruit was quickly opened on the table. I sat down beside them and listened as one story turned into another, until the house gradually settled into its usual end-of-day rhythm. Before turning off the lights, I placed my phone on the charger. The target was still there, but I didn't open the app to check it again. Work kept me at my desk until late in the afternoon. After sending an email, I glanced at the date in the corner of the screen and suddenly stopped. I had almost forgotten that today was my wife's birthday. I looked at the clock. There was still enough time to finish what I was doing and leave a little earlier than usual. I shut down the computer after taking care of the last piece of work. On the way to pick up the kids from school, I stopped at a flower shop and chose a bouquet, then waited while the florist wrapped it. The paper rustled as she adjusted the last few stems and tied a ribbon around the bouquet. While I waited, I took out my phone to check the time. There was a notification from the trading app on the screen. I opened my portfolio and saw that the stock was falling. The price had moved quite a bit lower than when I had checked it at my parents' house. I was still in profit, and the target I had set hadn't changed, but the distance between the two numbers had widened. The florist handed me the bouquet. I looked at the price one more time, turned off the screen, and put the phone back in my pocket. I carefully placed the flowers on the passenger seat and drove to the school to pick up the kids. As soon as the younger one opened the car door, she saw the flowers and asked what was happening today. The older one got into the back seat, looked at the bouquet for a moment, then remembered that it was Mom's birthday. The two of them immediately started discussing how they should give her the flowers when we got home so they could surprise her. On the way back, almost their entire conversation was about the bouquet. My phone stayed in the compartment in front of me. I didn't open the market board again after leaving the flower shop. When the car pulled into the yard, the younger one grabbed the bouquet first while the older one ran inside to call Mom. I followed behind them, closing the car door as I listened to their excited voices ahead of me. My wife came out. The kids handed her the flowers before I could do anything, then competed to tell her that Dad had almost forgotten her birthday. Before I could explain myself, my wife looked at me and smiled. "Where's my present?" I pointed at the bouquet in her hands. "There it is." She looked at the flowers, then back at me. "I don't want a present anymore. Just transfer me the money." The kids burst out laughing. I laughed too and asked how much she wanted. She carried the flowers inside and said she would think about it and let me know later. The conversation continued through dinner. The kids started discussing what Mom should buy, each of them suggesting something completely unrelated to the other. After listening for a while, my wife said it would probably be better if she chose for herself. If she left the decision to the two of them, we might still be choosing by her next birthday. My phone stayed on the shelf all evening. The market had closed long ago. Inside the house, there was only the bouquet now sitting in a vase, the voices of the kids, and the ongoing conversation about a present that still hadn't been chosen. After dropping the kids off at school the next morning, I drove my wife to the place where she wanted to look for her present. The joke from the night before about transferring money still wasn't over. As soon as she got out of the car, she turned to me. "I changed my mind. There's still time to transfer the money." I locked the car and looked at her. "Tell me how much first." "You transfer it first, then I'll tell you." I laughed and walked inside with her. My wife stood in front of a display case for quite a while before turning to ask which one I thought suited her better. I looked at the two things she was pointing at and tried to give her my opinion. She told me that everything I picked looked the same anyway. While she moved over to the next counter, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I took it out and saw that the stock had fallen again. The price was still above the levels where I had sold the earlier portions. The shares I was still holding were still profitable, but the distance to the target had grown wider again. My wife came back from the counter and asked me something. I hadn't heard her clearly, so I looked up and asked her to repeat it. She looked at the phone in my hand, then pointed at the item she was holding. "Are you even looking?" I put the phone back in my pocket, stepped closer, and took a proper look. "Okay, this time I'm really looking." She laughed. For the rest of the time we spent choosing her present, I left my phone in my pocket. After changing her mind a few times, my wife finally chose something she liked. I paid, took the bag from the employee, and walked with her toward the parking lot. Once we were in the car, I opened my phone one more time. The price still hadn't recovered. I looked at the target I had saved, then locked the screen. My wife placed the shopping bag on her lap and asked what we should have for lunch. I started the car, pulled out of the parking lot, and we talked about a few places we could stop at on the way home. When we got back, the shopping bag was placed beside the vase of flowers. As soon as the kids came home, they ran over to ask what Mom had bought. The conversation from the night before started all over again, with both of them insisting that their own suggestion would have been better. The evening went on longer than I expected. After dinner, the kids still had some homework to finish. My wife took out her new present again and asked me one more time whether I thought she had made the right choice. By the time the house finally became quiet, I went to bed. The alarm went off while I still wanted to lie there a little longer. I turned it off, stared at the ceiling for a few seconds, then got out of bed. By the time I drove out of the neighborhood, the sun was already higher than usual. Instead of going straight to the office, I stopped at the familiar noodle shop on the way to work. The place was already quite busy. People calling out their orders, bowls and chopsticks clinking together, and traffic outside blended into the familiar sounds of the morning. I found an empty seat, ordered my food, placed my phone on the table. Steam rose from the bowl of noodle that had just been set in front of me. I added some vegetables and picked up my chopsticks when the phone screen lit up with a price notification. I opened my portfolio. The stock was rising. This wasn't one of those small moves like the previous rebounds. The price had climbed quickly, and the profit on the shares I was still holding had grown again. The target was still higher, but the distance had narrowed considerably. I looked at the market board, then at the time in the corner of the screen. The session had only recently started. If the stock could keep moving like this, the remaining distance wasn't that far. The server placed a glass of tea beside my bowl. I moved the phone aside to make room and continued eating, but after only a few bites, I opened the screen again. The price had moved higher. The distance to the target was a little shorter now. My bowl of noodles slowly cooled as I ate, while watching the price move. Sometimes the stock would stop. I would put the phone down. Then, not long afterward, my hand would reach over to check it again. By the time I stood up to pay, the target still hadn't been reached. I walked out of the shop, opened the car door, and placed my phone in the compartment in front of me. Morning traffic had grown heavier, and there was already a long list of things waiting for me at work. I merged into traffic and continued toward the office. When I reached my desk, a coworker was already waiting with several documents that needed to be handled. I put down my bag, turned on the computer, and we started discussing them immediately. Work windows began filling the screen one after another. Emails, spreadsheets, and numbers quickly took over my attention. My phone sat beside me, occasionally lighting up and then going dark again. When the discussion finally paused, I picked it up. The stock was still in the green, but the price had pulled back. At morning, the distance to the target had been small. Now it was beginning to widen again. A call came in while I was still looking at the screen. I answered, opened the file the person on the other end needed, and talked through it with them. By the time the call ended, the price had fallen further. The profit that had grown at the noodle shop had shrunk with it. I put the phone down and returned to the spreadsheet in front of me. A few minutes later, my hand reached for it again. The price continued to move lower. What if it fell even more by the end of the session? I looked at the number of shares I still held. After selling twice during the previous sessions, this was the final part of the position. The target was still above, but since I had been sitting at the noodle shop that morning, the price had moved close to it, then moved away again. A coworker sent another document through the chat window. I opened the file, replied with a few lines, then looked over at my phone. There was still plenty of work in front of me. I couldn't sit there watching the market board for the rest of the session. If I waited until the end of the day and the price kept falling, the profit I still had would shrink again. I opened the order window and entered all the remaining shares. The target I had saved was still above the current price. Someone from the next desk called me over to look at a number. I told them to give me a moment, then turned back to my phone. The price had just moved lower again. My finger stopped over the confirmation button. That morning, the stock had come very close to where I wanted to sell, but now the distance was widening again while work kept interrupting me. I sent the order. The fill confirmation appeared shortly after. The last of the shares disappeared from my portfolio. Only the money that had returned to my account remained. I looked at the screen for a few seconds, locked the phone, and stood up and walked over to the next desk to continue the work that had just been interrupted. New emails kept arriving. A meeting ran longer than expected. Then there was a file that needed to be revised before it could be sent. My phone remained beside the computer, but I didn't open it again. By the time the last piece of work was finished, the sunlight outside the window had softened. I saved the file, sent it, then leaned back in my chair for a while. The position I had held for months was finally over. The profit was now in my account. But the sense of relief I had thought would come with it wasn't as clear as I had expected. I turned off the computer, picked up my phone and keys, and left the office. Traffic was heavier on the way home. The stops at red lights lasted longer than usual, but I didn't open the trading app again. By the time I pulled into the yard, the last of the afternoon sunlight was falling across only part of the wall in front of the house. The kids were sitting in the living room when I opened the door. The birthday flowers were still on the table, a few of the petals now opening wider. The present my wife had chosen was sitting nearby. I changed my clothes and sat down beside the kids. One handed me some homework to ask about, the other started telling me something that had happened at school. From the kitchen, my wife asked whether work had been busy today. I answered her, then got up and went inside to help carry the food out. My phone stayed on the shelf. Dinner passed with the usual conversations. Afterward, the kids went back to their schoolwork, and my wife carried the remaining things into the kitchen. It wasn't until everything around the house had settled down that I picked up my phone and went into the study. My notebook was still on the desk, open to the exact page with the number I had calculated earlier. I opened the trading app and looked at the closing price. My hand stopped on the screen when I realized the price had moved above my target. I pulled the notebook closer. The number I had once decided I would sell at was still there on the page. It hadn't been changed. And I opened my transaction history. The price of the sell order I had placed at work was below my target, and the closing price had already moved above it. I looked at the three prices one more time. The price where I had sold, the target I had set, and where the market had gone before the session ended. I put the phone down. From the living room, I could still hear the kids. My wife said something to them, and all three of them laughed. A little while later, the phone was back in my hand. The closing price was still the same. The number in my notebook was still the same. That morning, the stock had come very close to it, then turned back down. At the office, I watched my profit shrink while work kept interrupting me, and eventually, I didn't wait any longer. I sold. I locked the screen and placed the phone beside the notebook. The room was much quieter than the living room outside, but the disappointment was still there. All the way through, the price moving up, then pulling back. All I had wanted was for it to move just a little faster, and when it finally reached the place I had been waiting for, I was no longer there.